People traveling by car or to certain areas of the United States, particularly the state of Florida, this summer vacation. You might be driving scared. What is driving scared? Well, it's like driving dirty, only the dirt is the color of your skin. I've got some explaining to do. Let's get into it. Hey there, Allians. Welcome back for another episode of Ayana Explains It All, the podcast hosted by the Black Muslim lady lawyer who has an opinion on everything. Born and raised in the hood, living in the suburbs of Northeast Ohio, avoiding Little Mermaid spoilers. Don't tell me how it ends. Oh my God. Ayana Explains It All is available on 14 different streaming platforms, including Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and we also have our own YouTube channel, as well as our own website. Yes, check out the new website of AyanaExplainsItAll.com. That's www.AyanaExplainsItAll.com. My name is spelled Ayana. You go over to the website, you can find full episodes as well as transcripts of each episode. You can find information on how to support the podcast with a monetary donation. This started off as a hobby for me, and now I'm trying to take it to higher levels. And I've been able to trademark the name of the podcast and the logo, and I'm so excited about that. So go on over to AyanaExplainsItAll.com and let me know what you think. You can leave a review. You can rate the podcast. You can subscribe to the podcast. You can subscribe to emails from the podcast. You can leave me a voicemail message. There's so many things you could do, so many ways to reach out to me, the host, Ayana Fakir. And please do share Ayana Explains It All, the podcast, with your friends, your relatives, your neighbors, a doctor, your favorite customer service representative at Netflix when you call them to cuss them out because they have told you that you are no longer a part of the household whose account you've been sharing. I might cuss a little bit. So if you're uncomfortable with hearing curse words, with hearing swears, you can just skip over those. Just skip them. Just pretend like you didn't hear them. Pretend like it's your kids who have been yelling and screaming for 3 hours and you've tuned it out. Let me know what you think of the show and what topics you would like to have covered on the show, what topics you want me to bring my unique voice to. So far, I have covered everything from politics to religion to health to psychology to sociology, racial justice. I've talked about health equity. I've talked about some personal things that I've been through. I cover everything. I don't leave anything on the table. We're going to talk about it all, and you're going to learn something. Ayana Explains It All is the podcast that bridges the gap between current events and human behavior. And this week, the NAACP has issued a travel advisory for the state of Florida. Now, usually when the NAACP issues a travel advisory, it's because something really severe is happening and they want to warn Black people about. But this is something we've been noticing creeping up for a while now, how tense things have gotten in the state of Florida because of recent legislation. But on May 23rd, 2023, the NAACP issued a formal travel advisory for the state of Florida in direct response to Governor Ron DeSantis's aggressive attempts to erase Black history and to restrict diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in Florida schools. In fact, he has eliminated them. He says that public money cannot be spent on promoting diversity, equity, inclusion, because for some reason he thinks that it's all equal now, that he thinks it's diverse enough, that he thinks it's inclusive enough. Although when he speaks of inclusive, he means anything but Black history, the history of the LGBTQIA community, talking about gay people. He doesn't like that. He doesn't want undocumented immigrants. He doesn't want migrants. He doesn't want to promote these things because he believes, wrongly, like many people do, that it's diverse enough, that it's inclusive enough. and that there is equity, and that this is making white people feel subjected. It's making them feel poorly. It's making them feel like they're the problem, like they're a problem. The problem is not white people. The problem is the legacy of racial injustice and racial segregation that even in the state of Ohio has not been dealt with. Every state in this union has some problematic history that it has not dealt with, that it needs to deal with, that it needs to reckon with before we can move on and say, yes, everything is diverse and inclusive and equitable. Everything is fair. No, there's lots of areas of American society where things are unfair. I've spoken in the past about housing and employment and income and pay and health inequities. To say that you can no longer give money to diversity, equity, and inclusion programs because we're over this already, we should not have had to do this in the first place, is foolish. If you look at the state of Florida, I mean, the only reason why they have a burgeoning economy is because of one, Disney World, and two, because of the beaches. If Disney World were to leave Florida, which, I mean, they probably should consider that because things have gotten so tense for them. If Disney World were to leave, the state of Florida, the economy would collapse. It would. It just would. That's billions of dollars right there in tourism dollars that are going to leave. I don't know where you would go that would be more friendly and warm and great. I mean, there's Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana. I don't know. A lot of those places are quite similar to Florida. So you're kind of limited there. But the NAACP, their formal travel notice states, Florida is openly hostile towards African Americans, people of color, and LGBTQ individuals. Before traveling to Florida, please understand that the state of Florida devalues and marginalizes the contributions of and the challenges faced by African Americans and other communities of color. And that's fucking true. Now, before I get into giving you guys a history of what I'm talking about, I want to say that all of the sources that I cite in this episode of Ayana Explains It All will be listed in the episode description. I put links to the different sites in the description of the episode. I use a bunch of different sources when I'm writing an episode of Ayana Explains It All, because even though I can explain it all, I don't know it all. I don't know it all. But I can bring you the most relevant information for this conversation. So you know the historical context, so you know the current happenings of what's going on, so that you can hear from experts who have already studied and discussed these things, and so that you know that I know what I'm talking about. I'm not just giving my opinion. Some of it is opinion, some of it is fact. If you've studied African American history, or American history, as Morgan Freeman would say, then you've heard about the Ocoee Massacre in Florida, and you have probably watched the movie Rosewood, directed by the late director John Singleton, about the Rosewood Massacre. You know that Florida has a history of racial difficulties, that whites have had with the presence of blacks in their state. So you know that this is not the first time that Florida has been hostile to Black Americans. At the end of Reconstruction, American Reconstruction, when towns and counties across the country were putting themselves back together, a lot of these towns and counties became so-called sundown towns. Now, a sundown town is an all-white community that intentionally kept blacks out of town. And I'll talk about this later, but it wasn't just blacks. There were ethnic exclusions as well. But these were communities that kept blacks out of town by force, law, and custom. Some even posted signs saying, "Negro, don't let the sun go down on you." Or, "We want white tenants in our community." Blacks knew that this meant they had to be out before sundown, or that they couldn't stop at all, or that they could come here and work, but they had to leave before the sun went down. They knew that it meant that they could face violence, even death, if they were caught in the town after dark or at all. Now, this information comes from an article published by WFTV Channel 9 out of Orlando, Florida, and it's all about sundown towns in the state of Florida. The article states that often people of different backgrounds or ethnicities could work or be there to help stimulate the economy, but could not remain there after sunset. And then they go on to tell the story of how the Ocoee Massacre led to the creation of a sundown town. And the Ocoee Massacre and what followed was a mass racial violence event that saw a white mob attack numerous African American residents in the northern parts of Ocoee, Florida, a town located in Orange County near Orlando. The massacre took place on November 2nd, 1920, the day of the U.S. presidential election. It's estimated that 30 to 35 Black people were killed in the violence. Most African American owned buildings and residences in northern Ocoee were burned to the ground. Other African Americans living in southern Ocoee were later killed or driven out of town by threat of further violence being used against them. Thus, Ocoee essentially became an all-white or sundown town. The massacre has been described as the single bloodiest day in modern American political history. The attack was intended to prevent Black citizens from voting. Black people had essentially been disenfranchised in Florida since the beginning of the 20th century. In Ocoee and across the state, various Black organizations had been conducting voter registration drives for a year. And so on that day when Blacks were attempting to vote in the election, white people were upset and decided to attack in mobs, killing at least 30 Black people, all because they wanted to vote. And so they ended up driving all of the Black citizens out of Ocoee, and it essentially became an all-white or sundown town. And the article goes on to state, especially after dark is when most crime happens. White people thought by keeping these individuals out, the community would be safer. That was the white people's beliefs. They also wanted the land that Black people held. As recently as the late 1990s, Ocoee was still considered a sundown town until finally in 2018, the city issued a proclamation acknowledging the massacre, and in it wrote the following: "Let it be known that Ocoee shall no longer be the sundown city, but the sunrise city, with the bright light of harmony, justice, and prosperity shining upon all our citizens." Now you have to imagine what it took for the city government of Ocoee to finally say, you know what, this legacy of hatred and ugliness and violence needs to be dealt with, finally, and we need to acknowledge this and move on. It had to have taken a lot because they didn't do it until 2018. It had to have taken a lot of courage for them in the face of all of the other political violence and uprisings that were going on in this country around that time because of racial unrest, thanks to Donald Trump and his presidency, for them to finally say, we don't want to be associated with this. We don't want to be associated with racial violence. We don't want to be associated with any of this. But before we disassociate ourselves, before we remove ourselves from that, we have to acknowledge that it happened. We have to acknowledge what happened. We have to deal with it, and then we have to move on. But throughout the history of the United States, various forms of racial discrimination have marred the nation's progress towards equality and justice, towards the point where we can all say that we're no longer the place of racial disharmony, racial injustice, that we are making progress towards equality and justice. But one such grim aspect of the various forms of racial discrimination in the United States is these sundown towns. These towns, predominantly found throughout the U.S. in the South, but also the North and the Western states, enforced strict racial segregation by intimidating or excluding African Americans and other minority groups after sunset. Sundown towns still serve as a painful reminder of the deep-rooted racism that has shaped America's past and continues to influence its present. Now, as I said before, you can trace the beginning of sundown towns to the post-Civil War era when African Americans were gaining some semblance of freedom through the Emancipation Proclamation and the abolition of slavery. However, the racial tensions and hostilities that permeated the country's social fabric were far from over. And in response to the increasing migration of African Americans to the North in search of better opportunities, some white communities sought to maintain racial homogeneity by implementing exclusionary practices. In response, they implemented exclusionary policies to keep African Americans out of their towns. These free Black people bothered them so much, seeing them vote, seeing them work and live and mix with white people. The very presence of Blacks made white people feel threatened, and so they lashed out, and they lashed out with violence. Killing Black people, destroying their churches and schools and businesses to drive them out of the city. Anywhere, any city, I'll just add this, any city where Blacks and whites were present had to be segregated. That was racial segregation. That was Jim Crow. Any city that had Black and white people had to be segregated by law. So I mentioned before how sundown towns were a response to post-Civil War era when Black Americans gained freedom. They had gained the ability to move about the country. They were working and they were looking for places to live. And a lot of them were headed to the North and Midwestern regions. Black people knew immediately they were not welcomed. You weren't allowed to rent. You weren't allowed to buy. You weren't allowed to establish a business presence. They made it very known that Blacks were not welcome. There had to be separate bathrooms, separate drinking fountains, separate lunch counters, separate. There had to be separate train cars and parts of the bus. Now, this wasn't just in the South. It was in the North and the Midwest, too, where this deep-rooted hatred of Blacks created this racial segregation. And the state of Florida was heavy with segregated communities. Whites created exclusionary practices that kept Black people from even being on beaches. You couldn't even visit a beach. You especially could not be on a beach with white people. Sundown towns were characterized by a strict segregation policy that prohibited African Americans from residing within their limits, particularly after sundown. The purpose of these Negro "Don't let the sun go down on you" signs and policies was to intimidate and deter African Americans from entering or staying within the town's boundaries, thus perpetuating racial segregation. Enforcement methods varied from overt violence and threats to more subtle forms of discrimination. African Americans who accidentally found themselves in sundown towns after dark faced the risk of verbal abuse, physical harm, and even lynching. The presence of law enforcement officers often bolstered these practices, as they either turned a blind eye to racial violence or actively participated in it. And in Florida, local historians Marvin Dunn and Dr. Paul George say many towns with beach in their names were sundown towns because Black people had to be off the beach after dark. Many others cite Coral Gables as a sundown town, in addition to Gulfport or the entire Pinellas communities. At times, they also excluded Jewish people, Latinos, and anyone considered not to be white. And that's from an investigation of sundown towns in a look at South Florida's legacy of segregation. In Florida, cities with Black populations by law had to be segregated. So to say that this is no longer Florida's reality, yes, well, maybe it no longer is Florida's reality that cities are segregated by law, but by happenstance. There is de facto segregation that is occurring here by not having affordable homes for people to purchase, by not allowing certain people to rent in certain areas, by not creating employment opportunities, by perpetuating health inequities that keep these communities sick, that keep these communities dwindling. You have kept Black people and now Hispanics out of these ritzy white neighborhoods. You have effectively kept them out. Some cities, despite desegregation, despite the insistence that diversity and inclusion has occurred and that we're all equal and fair and happy and whatever the hell else, some cities have only a 4 to 6% Black American population. And for all other races, it's less than the Black population. Yeah, many of these cities that were sundown towns are still over 95% white. So if you're telling me that there's diversity and that there's inclusion, how come Blacks are still not at least 10 to 15% of your population? And you'll say, Ayana, well, I mean, they can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They can get jobs and make money and live here. No, there are still ways that you all are keeping Black people out of these communities. And you like it. You like it. There's still the attitude, the stigma that racial minorities bring violence to neighborhoods, that they bring unwanted interactions, that they bring down the property values. They don't work. They don't have jobs. They're on welfare. They stink up the neighborhood with their pork belly barbecue. Their culture is different. What if they're an ethnic community? What if they're Haitian and they don't speak English? That's the other thing. You don't want to interact with anyone who doesn't speak English. It really bothers the fuck out of white people. But it also bothers a lot of Americans. You come here, you got to speak English. Why? This is not an English-speaking country. It's a country where people speak English. The United States is a country where people speak English. It is not an English-speaking country. There are so many different languages spoken in the United States that to tell someone when they come here that they can only talk one way is ridiculous and offensive. Getting back to Florida, however, these patterns of exclusion, as one study of the Southern Pinellas Sundown town goes on to say, these patterns of exclusion occurred throughout America and well into the 20th century. In the years before the Civil War, legislators in California, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Oregon even passed laws to outlaw former slaves from entering these sundown states. Some of these laws persisted as troops from those states fought against the Confederacy during the Civil War. Oregon's law remained on the books until 1926. Sundown suburbs also appeared, often created as zones for those who left urban areas during periods of white flight. Levittown, located on Long Island and one of the best-known post-war American suburbs, enacted prohibitions during the 1950s that prevented non-whites from living in that New York community. Long Island, New York. What a surprise. Actually, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. If you live in Ohio like me, you know that there are so many small towns in Ohio. A lot of rural areas, a lot of areas that people really don't, talk about too much. A lot of the big cities get all of the big stories and the big sports teams and all that. But there is a town in Ohio, unofficially known as East Jackson. It is part of the township of Waverly, Ohio. Now, Ohio, was established as a free state. And this information is coming from The Guardian. The Guardian did an entire study of the racial past of East Jackson and Waverly, Ohio. It's an amazing article about people there who were white appearing, but who are black or who were treated as black because of their proximity to blackness. So it says that Ohio was established as a free state at the start of the 19th century, but those fleeing slavery used Ohio's underground railroads to avoid Waverly. Yes, to avoid Waverly. It was anti-abolition and anti-black. It was also a sundown town where blacks were so hated that city officials created a section of the city just for blacks called East Jackson. They corralled anyone black or deemed black because of their appearance or by second-class status because they were laborers or housekeepers into the smaller town of East Jackson. Some forced to stay in East Jackson were not black. But because they all lived in East Jackson, grew up together, and were treated as black by law, a community that identified as black took root. They married across racial lines and had multicultural children and had multiracial children. Over generations, as fewer black people sought this area out, black heritage thinned out, but black identity did not. But during that time of segregation, blacks in Ohio were subjected to black laws, including the one-drop rule. That is, if you had one drop of black blood, you were disqualified from having the legal status of white, which became a widely accepted social attitude in Ohio beginning in the 1860s. So, when we look at things like Sundown Town and post-Civil War America, we think, oh, wow, it must have been so wonderful for people who moved to the North, these economic opportunities. It was free there. It was, it wasn't so bad. No, Ohio was terrible. Ohio was terrible. So no, sundown towns were not just a Southern phenomenon. They were an all over this entire country phenomenon. Oregon, California, Missouri, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, New York, Kentucky, Tennessee, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Oklahoma. I mean, these places existed all over the country. If you wanted jobs, you could work there. Sure, you could work there, but you had to be out before dark. You couldn't live there. But sundown towns and segregated communities are not necessarily one and the same. Segregated cities are carefully constructed through restrictive racial covenants and redlining, whereas sundown towns are created by violence and intimidation used to keep blacks away. But there was a time when Black Americans who were traveling throughout the United States knew exactly where not to stop while traversing parts of the U.S. And I'm talking about the Green Book. The Green Book, officially titled the Negro Motorist Green Book, was a travel guidebook specifically designed for African American travelers during the era of racial segregation in the United States. It was published annually from 1936 to 1967 by Victor H. Green, a postal worker from New York City. Now, you may have seen the movie starring Viggo Mortensen and Mahershala Ali from 2018 called Green Book. But the Green Book, the Negro Motorist Green Book that was published, was more than a guidebook. It was a lifesaver in the racist world of southern and western U.S. states, featuring motels and businesses that extended their services to Black travelers before the Civil Rights Movement helped bring about change. The Green Book provided African American travelers with information on safe and accommodating establishments. It aimed to assist Black Americans in navigating the often hostile and discriminatory landscape they encountered while traveling, particularly in the Jim Crow South. But there's also a portion of it on Route 66, and I went a little deeper into this, to the Route 66 part of it. There are studies of what places are still standing that were featured in the Green Book. A lot of them have been destroyed, but some of them have been converted into motels and little shops and museums and whatnot. Very interesting stuff. But the Green Book also featured articles, essays, and travel tips written by prominent African American journalists and writers. It became an indispensable resource for African American travelers, providing them with a sense of safety and empowerment. It allowed them to explore parts of the country that would have otherwise been daunting or dangerous. But despite its limitations, the guidebook played a vital role in supporting African American mobility and autonomy during a time of systemic racism and segregation. But as the civil rights movement gained momentum and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, the need for such a book diminished. The guidebook ceased publication in 1967 as racial discrimination in public accommodations became illegal. But what is funny is that it became illegal, but things were still not Black friendly. And I think there was still the need for such a guidebook, but publishing it was, I guess, something that they felt no longer was worthwhile because, hey, it's this, and this is the problem with the United States. We think, hey, something is illegal now, so that means that attitudes are automatically going to change. No, they didn't. They absolutely did not. That's why we still have segregated communities, because attitudes did not change. That's why we still, into the 90s, in the late 2000s, and into 2023, still have sundown towns, because attitudes have not changed. In fact, some attitudes are going backwards. They're going in reverse. There are sundown towns in Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas. But today, the Green Book serves as a poignant reminder of the challenges faced by Black Americans during the era of segregation, and as a testament to our resilience and determination to navigate an unjust system. And now this is going to sound familiar to people who look like me, but when you stop or drive through a city or town and you don't see people who look like you, like when you go to Walmart or IHOP and you don't see people who are Black, you start to panic. There are places like that in many northern states. It isn't just Florida or Georgia or Alabama or Texas where you wonder how you'll be treated or received, where you wonder if someone is going to give you a hard time or spit in your food or ask you to show a receipt for your purchase or accuse you of stealing. Black people are still having to outwit racists, and we do so now not through a guidebook, but through social media. We discuss Black-friendly places and places where we find anti-Black activity. We tell each other neighborhoods to avoid and places to patronize that are Black-owned. We want to support Black businesses, but we also want to feel safe while we're traveling and shopping. And we know that even though it's 2023, because attitudes have not all changed for the better to see our humanity, we still have to guide each other to safety. So many towns in the U.S. with Black populations, it seems, are still fighting against racism from law enforcement, legislators, shop owners, teachers, school administrators, neighbors. The existence of sundown towns has had far-reaching consequences for Black American communities, however. The fear instilled by these towns perpetuated a culture of self-censorship and hypervigilance among Black Americans, preventing us from freely moving or settling in areas outside predominantly Black neighborhoods. The denial of economic opportunities, housing, and education in sundown towns contributed to the systemic impoverishment and marginalization of Black Americans. Furthermore, the exclusionary practices of sundown towns reinforced racial stereotypes, perpetuated discrimination, and hindered the overall progress toward racial equality in the United States. These towns represented a deliberate attempt by white communities, to assert their racial superiority and maintain social dominance. So when you look at white communities and you see that they have only a 3, 4, or 5% Black population, then you know that is because of this lasting, ugly legacy of sundown towns and racial segregation. According to James Loewen, who passed away in 2021, but he was a brilliant sociologist out of Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi. He was an authority on sundown towns. He compiled a state-by-state database of sundown towns that continues even after his death. He discovered that there were more than 200 sundown towns in the state of Missouri alone. And if you recall, the state of Missouri recently had several instances of racial unrest, with one of them being the Ferguson police shooting of Michael Brown. But if you go to a majority white town and ask them if race has ever been an issue, they're likely to say no. But racial profiling from police and the sour treatment of blacks by whites, or the presence of hate groups targeting blacks and other non-whites, or discriminatory policies such as in housing and employment, tell a different story. These police shootings and beatings tell a different story. Like in Sullivan, Missouri, for instance, in 2014, a group of 15 white schoolgirls blacked up their faces for a game of football. And in Ferguson, the KKK staged a march through town while blacks were protesting against the death of Michael Brown and the decision to not indict the officer in that case. If you go to these towns and you ask them, is race a problem? They'll say no. But in the meantime, they're allowing the KKK to thrive. They're allowing their children to engage in discriminatory and racist practices. They're allowing racial discrimination to occur. If you ask them if it's a problem, no. But if you ask the black people, you ask the black residents, ask the Hispanic residents if race is a problem, they're probably going to say yes. In fact, I know they're going to say yes. Race isn't a problem when you're the one who's holding the stick. Race is a problem for the person you're beating with the stick. Recently, in Antioch, California, and McCurtain County, Oklahoma, we've seen instances of law enforcement scandals that show targeted acts of racism against citizens and other members of law enforcement. And I mentioned before that sundown towns were not just to exclude Black Americans, although that was primarily the target, but ethnic exclusions became a part of the sundown town arrangement. And this information is coming from Wikipedia. But blacks were not the only ones who were not allowed to live at times in white towns or traverse through white towns. Hispanics, Chinese people, Native Americans, Japanese Americans, for instance. Towns in Colorado had no Mexicans after nighttime signs. And in Connecticut, there was a policy of whites only within city limits after dark. California towns posted signs that barred Chinese residents from being out in public after dark. White residents drove Chinese immigrants out of the state of Idaho. And this is how in some regions, like even in Cleveland, Ohio, how Chinatowns and other ethnic enclaves were created. They wanted to live freely, but they also had no other choice. They had to live where there were other people who looked like them because they were not allowed to live with whites. The towns of Minden, Nevada and Gardnerville, Nevada had an ordinance from 1917 to 1974 that required Native Americans to leave town by 6:30 each day. And a whistle, later a siren, was sounded at 6 p.m. daily, alerting Native Americans to leave town by sundown. They, in fact, in Minden, they continue to play this siren, but now they claim it's being a nightly tribute to first responders. Such fucking bullshit. In Nevada, the ban was expanded to include Japanese American. And in fact, immigration and other laws and ordinances were created in municipalities to mimic the experience of Black Americans in sundown towns. Hispanic Americans were likely to suffer despite the purported target being undocumented immigrants in these cases of racial exclusion. And that is what is happening in Florida. They're calling these new laws, these new employment laws in Florida, anti-illegal immigration, anti-illegal alien, as they like to call them, immigration. You have to have papers to work. You have to be legal to work. But what it really is aimed at curtailing the number of Hispanics in Florida, the number of people who are coming to Florida who are Hispanic, the number of Hispanics who want to live among white communities, the number of Hispanics who want to work in white communities. They are trying to stop the proliferation of Hispanic culture and Hispanic growth in the state of Florida. Florida is not the only place where this is happening, but it's the most prominent. And they believe that if they keep Hispanics from working, because of course all Hispanics are illegal, right? If they keep them from working, then it'll mean that they can be excluded from living in the state, because you're not going to want to work where you can't live. And these people will go somewhere else. But the policies that they are using to stop the proliferation of Black thought and Black history in the state of Florida is only going to pour over into other ethnicities and races. Ron DeSantis passed a law requiring the teaching of Asian American history in schools. But guess what? If it wasn't for the civil rights movement for Blacks in the United States, you would not have the amount of Chinese migration, Japanese, Korean migration. But also, if it wasn't for war, you wouldn't have that either. But also, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, they were treated as shitty and as poorly as Blacks were treated. So if you discuss these people and their history, you also have to talk about racism and ethnic exclusion. You have to talk about war. You have to talk about the internment camps from World War II, where Japanese Americans were rounded up, had their property taken, placed into camps because there was a fear that maybe they were working for the enemy and that maybe they were going to harm Americans. We didn't know who to trust. You have to talk about that. But you also have to talk about all of the racial discrimination these people have faced in the United States, in the media, in housing, in business, and employment. You have to talk about that. You can't just talk about the history. You can't talk about the history of these people in the United States by bypassing the ugly side of it. They didn't come here, a lot of them, willingly. A lot of them came here to work. A lot of them came here to work. A lot of them were brought here because the United States bombed the fuck out of their country, because the United States started a war in their country and they were evacuated out. A lot of them were separated from their families. You can't talk about the history of Asian Americans in the United States or even abroad without talking about the atrocities. You cannot bypass that. You cannot gloss over it. And you cannot acknowledge their presence in the United States without acknowledging that they were helped by the civil rights movement for Blacks in the United States. So, recognizing the historical significance of sundown towns, including in the state of Florida, is crucial in understanding the racial dynamics that still affect American society. It is essential to acknowledge the pain and trauma inflicted upon Black Americans and other marginalized groups through such practices. Public education, historical preservation, and open dialogues are necessary to confront this dark chapter in American history. Florida has a history of racial segregation that it is trying to distance itself from, but by pretending that it did not exist. You do a poor job of distancing yourself from something by pretending that it did not happen. When you ignore that it happened, then you cannot deal with the effects of it, because in your mind, everything is fine, everything is okay. But the people remember. And I mentioned before about the Rosewood Massacre in the movie Rosewood that was directed by John Singleton in 1997. But there was little press about this. So most of what we know about it came from stories of survivors. The town of Rosewood was destroyed in what contemporary news reports characterize as a race riot. Florida had an especially high number of lynchings of Black men in the years before the massacre, including a well-publicized incident in December 1922. But before the massacre, the town of Rosewood had been a quiet, primarily Black, self-sufficient whistle stop on the Seaboard Airline Railway. Trouble began when white men from several nearby towns lynched a Black Rosewood resident because of accusations that a white woman made in nearby Sumner that she had been assaulted by a Black drifter. A mob of several hundred whites combed the countryside hunting for Black people and burned almost every structure in Rosewood. For several days, survivors from the town hid in nearby swamps until they were evacuated to larger towns by train and car. No arrests were made for what happened in Rosewood. The town was abandoned by its former Black and white residents. None of them ever moved back, and the town ceased to exist. Although the rioting was widely reported around the United States at the time, few official records documented the event. The survivors, their descendants, and the perpetrators all remained silent about Rosewood for decades. 60 years after the rioting, the story of Rosewood was revived by major media outlets when several journalists covered it in the early 1980s. The survivors and their descendants all organized in an attempt to sue the state of Florida for failing to protect Rosewood's Black community. Officially, the recorded death toll during that week in January 1923 was 8. Some survivors' stories claim that up to 27 Black residents were killed. In 1993, the Florida legislature commissioned a report on the incident. As a result of the findings, Florida compensated the survivors and their descendants for the damages which they had incurred because of racial violence. Blacks need to be aware that sundown towns still exist. In 2021, when many of us were following the Ahmaud Arbery case, it brought a reminder to many that even jogging in certain areas can pose a risk. And this information comes from an article published by communitysolutions.com. And they point out that the biggest mistake that Black travelers can make is assuming that their sole issues exist in the American South, or that the concept of a sundown town is a relic of the past. Sundown towns are not a relic of the past. The impact of sundown towns has a far-reaching result thanks to gerrymandering and redlining. Many rural and suburban communities were originally developed to be all white. This resulted in Blacks moving to urban areas or urban ghettos because Blacks were banned from living or traveling in certain areas. A news release dated February 16, 2022, announced that the city of South Pasadena, California, had passed Sundown Town Resolution, condemning the city's history as a sundown town and of institutional racism. Goshen City, Indiana, was one of the earliest cities to unanimously approve a resolution confronting its racist past in 2015. But few cities, as the article states, and I agree, have dealt with their racist past, and you cannot fix what you will not admit is broken. Each sundown town has to search its own soul and reckon with a past that still threatens the lives of non-white individuals. We're not able to change the hearts and minds of all people, but we can develop and improve policies that protect the rights of all Americans to drive anywhere and jog anywhere safely, regardless of the time of day or their skin color. Efforts to dismantle systemic racism and promote inclusivity, however, must continue, as we see the legacy of this racism is to exclude Blacks and other racial and ethnic minority populations from white neighborhoods. Local governments and community leaders should actively work to rectify the legacies of sundown towns by addressing racial disparities in housing, education, and employment opportunities. Encouraging diversity and cultural understanding through policy reforms and initiatives can help foster a more inclusive society. Sundown towns represent a deeply troubling aspect of American history. reflecting the persistence of racial discrimination and oppression. The existence of these towns enforced racial segregation and perpetuated a climate of fear and violence. Recognizing this historical injustice is crucial for understanding the challenges that marginalized communities face in their pursuit of equality and justice. By acknowledging and actively working to dismantle the remnants of sundown towns, society can take a significant step towards building a more inclusive and equitable future. And what Florida has refused to do is acknowledge and actively work to dismantle the remnants of racial segregation and exclusion in its white communities. Sundown towns had a profound impact on African American communities. The constant threat of violence and intimidation created a culture of fear and restricted Black Americans' freedom of movement. This limited our access to economic opportunities, housing, and education. Sundown towns reinforced racial stereotypes, perpetuated discrimination, and deepened the systemic impoverishment and marginalization of Black Americans. It is disheartening to hear how deeply entrenched racism was during that time. But what is equally disheartening is that people believe and advocate that this level of racism no longer exists and that our historically racist country is now safe for Black Americans, for Hispanics, and Asians. And superficially, perhaps that is the case. But if you peel back even one layer of this pearl onion, you'll find the truth. We have not reckoned with our past to declare evenly, firmly that we have evolved and society is equalized. Recognizing the historical significance of sundown towns and travel advisories warning Black people about the dangers of traveling to certain areas while Black is an important step. But if you are not teaching the history of Black Americans, of racial segregation in your schools, then people will not know the history and they will not be able to recognize the historical significance of this phenomenon. But we must acknowledge the pain and trauma inflicted upon Black Americans and other marginalized groups through these practices. Education plays a crucial role. But there are certain places where schools are not allowed to teach the legacy of the civil rights movement, segregation, Jim Crow, American slavery, and that is the state of Florida. They are not allowed to teach the legacy of the civil rights movement, segregation, Jim Crow, American slavery, nothing about American history that involves the atrocities of racial hatred and genocide, of bigotry against races and immigrants. Those things are not allowed. If you don't want the United States to be a racist country, then why are you afraid to confront history and rectify the racial disparities that persist because of that history? Why are you afraid to promote diversity, improve access to education, and address housing and employment inequalities and health inequities? Why are you afraid to discuss or even acknowledge the racial dynamics that still impact our society today? Black Americans in the 21st century need to be aware that sundown towns are still a reality. But by confronting dark chapters of American history, we can challenge the systems and structures that perpetuate racial inequality. It's essential to work towards building an inclusive and equitable future where everyone feels safe and welcome regardless of their background. And this has been Ayana Explains It All, brought to you by facts, figures, and enlightenment. Take care.